There are more than 30,000 kinds of beer in the world. And most start with the same 4 basic ingredients: malted grain, hops, water, and yeast, though each has a different recipe. And how those ingredients are brewed makes all the difference in the taste of the beer. A craft beer, like this Samuel Adams Boston Lager, is made from scratch. Using the slower, more traditional brewing methods rediscovered by the microbrew movement in the 1980s to create a distinctive flavor. But if everything isn't done just right, the brew could fall flat. Like all beer, the main ingredient in a craft brew is malt, which is simply a grain, in this case barley, that provides the sugars the yeast ferments into alcohol. But before the yeast can go to work, the brewer has to release the sugars by mixing the malt with water and cooking it into a mash. As the mash cooks, the heat converts the natural starches in the grain into sugars the yeast needs to create both flavor and alcohol in the beer.
Malt gives the beer body and sweetness and provides the food source for the yeast.
Different sugars are created in the mash at different temperatures. And each kind of sugar reacts with the yeast differently to contribute its own unique flavor to the beer. So to give the brewer more control over the temperature and ultimately the flavor, this craft brew is actually made from 2 mashes. It's an old world brewing method called decoction mash that Jim Koch first experimented with in his own kitchen, using a recipe created by his great-great-grandfather more than a century ago.
Brewing is a very practical science. It's really a lot of trial and error. So he perfected this recipe over 20 years, and I haven't messed with it.
To get the flavors of this recipe just right, the brewer brings the second, smaller mash to a full boil to release all the sugars and the flavors in the malt. Then, the brewer pumps the smaller, super hot mash into the larger mash. This causes the temperature of the larger mash to suddenly spike, creating still more sugars and flavors than can be achieved with a single mash.
Using 2 different kettles and 2 different mashes allows us to get a bigger range of sugars, and that gives the beer more body and flavor.
When the 2 mashes are fully mixed, the whole batch pumps into a 3rd kettle that separates the leftover grain from the sugary liquid. This liquid, now called wort, is what gets fermented into beer.
And if you try it, it's extremely sweet. And that sweetness is what the yeast is going to attack and create the CO2 and alcohol.
But there's one final ingredient that needs to be added before the yeast goes to work: the hops. Hops are dried flowers that add bitterness to balance out the sweetness of the malt and a fruity, citrusy aroma to the beer.
The only way to know if it's a really great batch of hops is to break open the flowers, which you do by this called the rub. And then you get a blast of aroma, and you know whether you've got great hops or not.
Because hops are only harvested once a year, they're dried and pressed into pellets to preserve their unique flavor and aromas until they can be brewed into the beer. Many beer recipes add 2 ounces of hops per barrel. But this recipe uses 10 times that amount, or a full pound of hops for every barrel, which makes the beer more robust. When all the hops are in, the wort pumps into a fermenting tank. And the yeast can finally go to work to ferment the sugars into alcohol.
This beer has got the yeast in it, happily fermenting away, making alcohol and some nice flavors. And you can see all that cloudiness. That is millions and millions and millions of yeast cells in there doing their little yeasty thing.
After a week of fermenting, everything moves to an aging tank for another 5 weeks. Then, the beer is finally ready for the final taste test.
I mean, that's my job. My job is to be the protector of the beer, so I still taste every batch.
And if it all comes together just right, the brewer has created a draft with a flavor and head that won't fall flat.